As we get started exploring using Python for data analysis and data visualization, we're going to want to install a tool called Jupyter Notebook. And the idea here is that until this point, you have probably been writing your Python code with what I would call a traditional IDE, something like Visual Studio Code or PyCharm or Eclipse or one of the many, many others that are available out there. And those are essentially all text editors, right? They make our code look pretty, and they help us find errors, and they let us execute the code easily when we're ready to test it. But when it all comes down to it, your programming source code is just text. And the workflow is you type in your source code, you execute the program and debug it and revise it, and you keep going. And eventually you have a program or a script that may be fairly big and complicated. It might be simple, but the idea is you're going to use that yourself, or you're going to share it with other people who can make use of it. And traditional IDE works very well for that. When we start talking about data analytics, our needs change a little bit. Instead of writing potentially big chunks of code, most of the Python we write is going to be really more like snippets, and they're going to be code snippets that are meant to kind of interact with data and produce some output that can help us understand what we're looking at, right? Charts and graphs and things of that nature. And it's not necessarily text-based in the same way that our traditional programs are. It's going to be a little more visual. So there are other products out there that do this, but Jupyter Notebook is the most popular one, and there are lots of resources available on web pages and YouTube and all that. So it's a really good choice for us. Now, with this video, I'm assuming that you have already installed Visual Studio Code and the Python extension for that, because I'm ultimately going to be using Jupyter Notebooks inside Visual Studio Code. So that's kind of where we are headed. Project Jupyter is the organization or the group that produces this, and they are at jupyter.org, and you can notice obviously the spelling there, which is a nod to Python. And they have installation instructions there, and you can start with that if you want, but what you're going to find as we go along is that there are a whole bunch of other things besides just Jupyter Notebook that are going to help us with rendering these visualizations and interacting with our data. So a much easier way to get started with Jupyter Notebooks is to install Anaconda. Anaconda is an open source distribution of Python that it gives you Python itself, it gives you a version of Python itself, and it bundles up a whole bunch of other tools that are really geared towards people who are doing data analysis or data science, as they call it. And that includes Jupyter Notebooks. So this is anaconda.com, and it is a paid product for people who are using it in kind of a professional capacity or an enterprise environment, something like that. But it is free to individuals, and so we're obviously going to want the free download. And it is cross-platform. It has detected that I'm on a Windows device, and so it is offering to give me that installer. If you want to see the other options, you can click here to get to that page and download whatever is appropriate for your system if it didn't detect that correctly. I do have a separate video for installing this all on a Mac, so you can jump over to that if you're working on a Mac. I'm going to go ahead and click to download this. I've actually already downloaded it to save time in the video. And once it's done downloading, I have this executable installer, and I'm going to double click to open that. The installation of Anaconda is pretty straightforward, and the default settings should be fine, but there are a couple that I wanted to kind of draw your attention to. Obviously, I have to accept the agreement. So the installation type, I can install it just for me to use on this computer, or I can install it system-wide so that every user on the computer can use it. And to do that, you have to have administrative access to the computer, which you have if it's your own personal device. If you're using a shared computer, or if you just don't care about other people having access to it, you can just use the Just Me selection there, and that should be able to install without any special access. The default location is fine for me. It probably is for you too. On the advanced options, the one that I really wanted to call your attention to is this second option that talks about adding this to your path environment variable. And it says right here that it's not recommended, and I just wanted to emphasize that. If you're an advanced user and you kind of understand what that does and what the implications of it are, it's fine to check that box, but it might lead to some unexpected behavior down the road. And after all, we're probably not using this as our primary Python usage. We're just exploring data science as part of this course that we're taking. The next option is about setting it as your default, and that one is fine, even though this may not be our primary usage for Python, because what we are using Python for, the original Python distribution is close enough to the Anaconda 3 distribution, so there's really not going to be any difference for us as far as that is concerned. So I'll go ahead and install this, and it's going to grind away for a couple moments. I will probably stop the video here and cut so that you don't have to watch all of this. Okay, so it looks like it's finished. I'm going to go ahead and hit next, and yeah, that's fine. Now, when we get to this last one, it's going to offer to give you kind of a getting started page or information. I don't really need that, but I will go ahead and launch the Navigator. This will take a moment to run. So the Anaconda Navigator is kind of the primary application that's like a launching pad, I guess you could say. It kind of gives you a user-friendly way to open the various things that are included in this package. And so a lot of these are going to be things that you've seen before. You might already have even had them on your computer. Probably not unusual that you might get asked to update the Navigator if it's out of date. I will do that later, so you don't have to watch me go through that, but you can obviously update it. Now, right here on my case, it depends on the screen size, obviously, but for me, Jupyter Notebook is up here at the top right. Next to that is Jupyter Lab, and Jupyter Lab is kind of the newer version. It's a little bit of a nicer user interface, and so if you're really going to be spending time in Jupyter, either one, then you probably want to go ahead and use Lab. We're going to be switching, or at least I am going to be switching over to Visual Studio and using it there. So I'm not worried about Jupyter Lab. I just want to open Jupyter Notebook to kind of show you the basic idea of it, so that when we open a notebook file in Visual Studio Code, you have some context for it. Okay, so Jupyter Notebook is web-based, I should say. It runs in your browser. It's a client-side program by default, so it doesn't actually connect to the internet unless you specify that you want it to do that. But it does take the appearance of a web page, right? And I certainly don't want to use Edge, so I'm going to tell it to use Chrome. I don't really like Chrome either, but I'm on my school computer, and that's what they want us to use. And so this is Jupyter Notebook here. And we'll take a look around a little bit just to make sure yours is working and that you understand what you're looking at. So at the moment, it's showing me my file structure, essentially. And it's just like anything else. We're going to have to either create a new file or open up an existing file. I'm just going to go into my Documents folder. I don't really have one set up for this. I didn't think of that. But I will create a folder here. I'm going to call it Jupyter Notebooks. And I'll go into that, and I'm going to now create a new notebook. And so it opens a new tab, and it's going to ask you about a kernel. And so the kernel is the little engine that kind of runs your code as we're working, and the default is fine here. This got installed with Anaconda, the IPy kernel, I guess is how you'd say it. And you might as well just check that to always use that one. You can change it if you ever want to. You can switch it up at the top here. And so this is the basic view that we get with Jupyter Notebooks. I'm going to right away change the name here, my first notebook. Actually, I don't know, I can't get over having spaces in file names, I guess because I'm old. I'm going to call it First Notebook. And the idea with a Jupyter Notebook file is that, and again, there's this confusion that I'm using the application called Jupyter Notebook, and the file that I've created is a Jupyter Notebook. And so, for example, in a little while, I'm going to open a Jupyter Notebook in Visual Studio Code. So it gets a little bit confusing, but that's the idea. The general approach to the user interface here is that a notebook is made up of these cells. And so a cell, on its most basic level, can be Python code. And so I'm going to just do the good old-fashioned hello world. Let me zoom in so that shows a little better on the video. I'm going to just do the good old-fashioned hello world because, again, I'm old and old school. And that's the first thing we often write. And so I can write code. It doesn't have to be one line. I can have multiple lines of code, and I can write whatever I want. It doesn't have to be these little print statements. But when I'm ready to execute all of my code, I can either execute just that cell, and then it would move on to the next cell, or I can run all the cells in my notebook, and it's going to ask me to restart. My kernel is unknown. There it goes. I just had to grind away at that a little bit. And so right below the cell where I can edit, it shows me the output or the result of that code when I run it. That's the basic idea. If I want to add another tab, or another cell, excuse me, I can add a cell above or below. They give you some shortcuts here. Just going to add one below. Oops, I just said that, and then I clicked the wrong one. So I'll show you how to click delete, and then we'll add one below. And up at the top, I can choose whether this is a markdown cell or a code cell. So Markdown is a language, or a markup language. I don't know if you really call it a language. You may have seen it when we look at GitHub, for example, for README files. But it's a little style of marking up your text so that it's sort of rich, and so you can have some basic formatting, and you can not just basic formatting. You can do all kinds of good stuff. So that's a whole topic unto itself. You can go Google it if you are curious, but for example, I can say my first notebook with you'll call that a hashtag. That is a pound symbol. And if I execute that, it interprets that pound sign to mean that this is a big heading. And so it makes my text nice and big. If I double click on that, I can edit it, and I happen to know, I don't know a lot of markup. I don't use it very often. And when I do, I just go look up what I'm trying to do because I can't remember stuff. But I'll go ahead and, I'll just change that to two hashtags, as you'd say, 2 pound symbols, and it gives me a slightly smaller heading. So that's the idea. I'm going to add some more down below. This is my first time using a Jupyter Notebook. It looks fun, and this isn't actually my first time, but that's what we'll say. And if I want to mark that up a little bit more, I can put like an asterisk around that, and when I execute it, that makes that italicized. If I do 2 of them, it should make it bold. And so there's this whole series of symbols. If you've done HTML or CSS, you're probably used to this type of markup because the M in HTML is markup after all. So it's very similar. But the idea is I can have these cells that are either code or markup, and I can use this to produce not just code, but it's actually sort of the product itself too. Right, so I can have code that generates a graph, and it'll produce that graph right below. And I can also use markup cells to annotate, right, to explain what we're looking at, and then I can share this with someone, and they can see all of my notes or whatever I have to say about the rest of this topic that we're talking about. this is Jupyter Notebook, the application, and we are editing a Jupyter Notebook file. And that's as far as I'm going to go with Jupyter Notebook as an application, because at this point, I'm going to want to switch over to Visual Studio Code, which is a little more consistent with what I've been doing with all my other Python work, and I just happen to love VS Code. So I'm going to now switch over and show you how to use Visual Studio Code to open a Jupyter Notebook and do this kind of work there. All right, so I'm going to save my work and stop it if necessary. I will go ahead and close these down. I'll also close the Anaconda Navigator. And I will move over to Visual Studio. So as I mentioned at the top of the video, I'm assuming that you have this installed and that it's set up with the Python extension, and that you've probably been using it for some basic development. Now there is a bunch of basically built-in support for Jupyter Notebooks, but I will go ahead and install, so I get everything. I'm going to go ahead and go to my extensions, and I'm going to install the Jupyter extension. Right, so I'm looking to make sure that this is the one from Microsoft. There are some other ones you can explore on your own, but I just want the main one here. I'm going to go ahead and install that. It gives me some help there if I want it. What I'm actually going to do is I'm going to just open, the way I typically start working in Visual Studio is I'm going to open a folder. So I'm going to go find that Jupyter Notebooks folder and open that, and you can see in my Explorer view over here, I've got firstnotebook.ipynb. That's the extension for one of these. And if I click on it, I have, now it looks, visually it looks a little bit different because I'm running in dark mode, for example, but it's the same basic idea. I have cells, and within a cell I can have either markdown or code. And I can, the user interface here, I've got some buttons I can use up there. I can also just play it right on the spot. The first time I run this, it's going to say that it needs, you may or may not get this depending on what all you have installed, but so I'm going to change the kernel. I should have done this before I hit play. I'm going to cancel that. So up in the top right corner here, it's going to show me what kernel I'm using. If I click that, what I want is the, there, I must have missed it before. I want to select another kernel. I'm just going to use the Python one, the Anaconda one. Sorry, I should say what I'm clicking on here. So I'm clicking on the little button here to select a kernel. I'm going to select right now it's using my primary Python installation that I had before. I want to select another kernel, and I'm going to choose from my Python environments. Within that, I see that default Python environment that I already had installed, that Python distribution, but I also see Anaconda. And so I'm going to change to that one. And now let's try it. I'm going to run all. There we go. Sorry for that little fumble there. So now I've got it set up to work. I can make my changes here if I want to add some exclamation marks, since I didn't keep those changes over in the other app. Then I can execute it. It just runs right on the spot. I can add a new cell for code. I can add a new cell for markdown. I can double click on this to edit the markdown and keep my change. I also have a little context menu here with these three dots for any cell that I want, whichever cell I have selected. And from there, I can change it to a code cell. I can change a code cell to a markdown cell, obviously. I can merge them. There's all kinds of editing options that I have here from that context menu. And that's the basic idea. The other thing I wanted to show you is, since if you're comfortable with Visual Studio Code, if I want to make another notebook in the same spot, I can just create a new file, And I'm going to call this one second notebook. And I just give it that same extension, IPYNB. And sure enough, I have another extension, or another notebook, excuse me. I've got this nice tabbed interface here. I can change this cell to Markdown, and I can say my second notebook, and run that, and it renders. So this is the basic idea of how to get started with Jupyter Notebook as an application, and the way that I'm going to use it is opening that file within Visual Studio Code. I honestly won't go back. I don't do any of my work in Jupyter Notebook application for the most part. I do it all within Visual Studio Code. It does everything that I need it to do. It's got this nice, comfortable interface that I'm used to, and often, maybe it's the nature of my work, but often I'm switching between kind of traditional Java scripts and Jupyter Notebooks, and this makes it really easy to do all of that in one app. If you have any questions, be sure and reach out and let me know. Otherwise, it looks like you are ready to go with Jupyter Notebooks.